Here is a red ink by TWSBI Red.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Certainly a red with no real showable lean any other way. Just looks like it's very faded. It gives a predictable tone variation by pen, so even though it does change and isn't really consistent in that way, at least you can predict, more or less the way it's going to come out. Now, it does have some shading in every pen, not particularly stand out, but it's definitely present. It's just when you see the darker parts, it makes me wish that it all came out that way, which the darker parts tend to look better than the lighter parts to me. Wish there was more of it. While I'm not a fan of this ink myself, I also know that I'm not a fan of red inks. So, ink, it's not you, it's me.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Nib Creeper. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, first I'm going to point out, just ignore that scribbly bit up at the top. There was some weirdness, and I was just covering it up. It wasn't anything. It was something on my hand that got on the nib. The extra fine, it's a very faded red with no feathering, with no spread. Yes, I'll say it shades, because if you look at slipping, the P's are a bit darker than the rest of the word. When you look at they on the second line, it starts lighter, gets darker at the H, lightens up at the EY. I can't say that I'm a fan of what I'm seeing, because so much of it is this lighter red that it really is kind of disappointing in a way. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. There is no feather. There is no spread. There is ish shading, but again, it's because it's coming across as a very light red. And you see it in Gandalf. The L is a bit darker, and it darkens up even a little bit more into the F, but the most of the word is really light. And again, red's not my favorite, but the tone I'm getting here, I'm really not happy with. I am happy that it doesn't have a lean as being a pink. It's just a very light red. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. It has no feather. It has no spread. The shading, I think, shows nicer here. Look at Told, how it starts lighter and works its way darker. Look, starts dark, lightens up on the O's, darkens again at the K. Let on the second line starts darker and gets lighter, stays light after the E. So it shades well. I prefer all of the darker tones that are there, not the lighter tones. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 8 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine, little flatter as a tone, which it kind of looked rather flat before, but it's flatter now. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, which is the way I prefer to see a red come out. It's like black and red and orange. I don't really care for tons of shading. Orange when it does it well, it's great. If it doesn't, I would prefer it as a straight orange. Red, I would prefer to have as a straight red, kind of what we're getting here, just as a darker tone than what we're getting here. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. Again, this paper, in the fact that it's not really a fountain pen friendly paper, so the shading won't always come through as well, and it's being a benefit here. Again, I would prefer a darker red, but to me, what I'm seeing here is acceptable. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we are definitely getting shading. You see it in first that starts darker, lightens up in the middle, darkens up at the T. Class starts light, gets dark at the L, lightens up again, but at the end of the last S, it darkens. Burglar has a ton of shading within it. It's a shame that it's shading so well in this case, just because I don't care for it doing that in a red. I do think if you like to see a shading red, what we're seeing here with the stub could really be up your alley. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. I'm really pleased with the color that we're seeing. This paper will bring out any kind of tone shift that an ink can have, and we're not getting any of it. So it's doing very well in that way. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades about the way that it did on the Clairfontaine. Seeing that Balin starts lighter, gets darker at the LI, light again at the N. All directly underneath it starts lighter and gets darker as it moves through. So again, if you like shading on a red, this is not doing too bad. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. Pleased is a fairly dark word, but the S right in the middle is a bit lighter, and with right next to that starts lighter and gets darker. Where there right next to it is completely a darker word. Not as dark a red as I would prefer, but I do prefer that from what I'm seeing and how the shading works out. This could be a decent red, I think, for people. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading. Oh, look at it as an O on the second line. The O is a bit lighter than the H was. If you go down to the third line, you see U is a nice lighter tone, where no right next to it starts dark and works its way lighter. Quietly, right at the very end, much darker word the whole way through. Very nice. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems writing back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. And the lighter tone, I mean, It's light at a point that you still see the vertical lines, making it a bit distracting. So to me, if you use quad rule paper and you want red as a second color, this might not be the best ink for that. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at first. The F is dark. It lightens up at the I. The top of the R is a little bit darker, lightens up into the S where the T is very dark. A lot of color shift in that one word, where mouse underneath that, light tone the whole way, and has starts dark and works its way light again. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading in a red, which is not a common thing. A lot of reds don't really shade, so I will give this ink credit for doing that. On the second line, look at I, that the beginning of the I is lighter and it darkens up the rest of the I, and take is a little bit lighter at the beginning, darkening up quite a bit at the KE at the end, which underneath starts lighter and works its way darker, so it is shading very well if you want a shading red ink. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading. Look at servant. First line, the T is quite a bit darker than the rest of the word. Dots on words tend to be quite a bit darker. When we're looking at a third line, they, the H where the T crosses it, and the Y are a bit darker than the rest of the word. Same with wanted. The TE is a bit darker than the rest of the word, and the downstroke of the D. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Dukeski Incline Station Red. Here is Diamine Blood Orange. Here is Papier Plume Red. Here is Private Reserve Vampire Red. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, a little bit flatter in its delivery. No feather, no spread. It still is shading. The quad rules, because they're not as standout, I think, because of the tone of this paper, I think here it's not as distracting as it was on the Rhodia. So if this is the type of paper that you're using, I think this ink as a second could be fairly good. No feather, no spread, shades very well. Look at they on the first line, darker to lighter. Down directly underneath it, dark to light to dark. About, the B and the T are dark, but the rest of the word is light. So it shades pretty darn good. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We get some shading, not tons, but I started to screw up on, particularly on the first, so I just crossed it all. But where that cross happens, on the L's and the T's, it is a bit darker. Riddle, the first D is a little darker than the second D, and the LE darker than the D they're coming from. Competition, the P's and the T's are darker than the rest of the word. Definitely bringing some shading through. Here, it's just... The color of the red is not a for me, but I do think this works very well here. I get stuck on, this is not my red. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. I would say if you're using this paper, use a stub nib for that second because I think this is the best look that we're getting for this ink here. And I think the bit thicker really helps out. You get the no feather, the no spread, you get the shading, but you get shading in a way that you sort of expect the stub to deliver. Not huge and stand out, but definitely there, definitely adding just a little bit to your writing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We could easily continue our lab notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Pelican Tanzanite. Here is a gray ink by Private Reserve Gray Flannel. Here is a blue ink by Califolio Olanga. Here is a black ink by Diatramentis Artist Ink Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine, it is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers, it spreads, it is usable, I think, for many people. If you really insist on using the 20-pound rag garbage toilet paper, that copy paper, that's the word. If you really insist on using the 20-pound toilet paper, copy paper, that's the you could do it. This, even though this isn't my favorite of reds, I think you're missing out on what could be a nicer red. The feathering in a spread is a bit distracting. While the feathers aren't huge, in this case, I do find it a little bit distracting. I keep drawing my eye towards what on the second line with the featherings on the H and the about on the B and the T. Again, it's not that the feathering's out of control or that this is unusable. I am nitpicky. I know it. I don't care for this on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was. Well, tough. Same darkness that we have on the Clairfontaine. Now here, I'm seeing a bit of a pink lean. I see it in I on the first line, ran on the first line, mist on the second, I on the third. I know not all of this is on screen yet. The tone shift that's gone for this paper is not in its favor. It does feather, it does spread, both as you would expect. It does mean that if you really wanted to use this, you have to pay attention to the speed and size that you write, or you wind up with the gobbledygook that is my writing on this page. Oh, and it's not shading. So that's good here. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone that it was with the medium. Little bit lighter, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still, it's really showing off that pink lean that we were seeing in the medium. It's all over it. And this ink doesn't really have a pink lean. You've already seen the chromatography. It shouldn't really be there. It's an effect of the paper. The feathering is gross. The spread is grosser. Grocery, not groceries. That would be food. This is not food. It's just gross in spread and in feather. Now, it's not shading. It is ink on the page, so I won't take that from it. It's not the ink's fault. It's the paper's fault. Looking at the back of the page, you see that you can't write back here. You're not going to read any of it. Don't be foolish, but nothing bled through, corrupting the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The ink performance is fine. I just want a darker form of it. The closest I saw here is the red, or to the red that I want, was in the stub, which leads me to think that a very wet pen for the darker red is the best way to go. Perhaps a gusher of a medium nib would be perfect. Now, if you really did like the shading, then I think you could probably go with just about any pen, and you might want to get checked out by a doctor for liking shading reds. That's just, you can like shading reds. It doesn't bother me. I'm just not running after this ink because I am not a fan of that happening. It's a little light. Get it wetter with the gusher of a medium.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.